particular subject, this idea of engaging kids around the world with what it is that might be laid on their heart. I think God breaks off pieces of his heart and deposits it into to all of us, regardless of our ages. And getting kids engaged and awakened to how God might want to use them in their own houses, in their own communities, in their own soccer teams and classrooms, but also in places across the world. It's been a passion of mine for a long time. So I'm really pretty much a storyteller, Sean. And so what I want to do is tell your audience a couple stories about ways in which I've seen kids engage and what's resulted in their life afterwards, and the adults that help cultivate that in a way that was meaningful and age appropriate for them. So I think the first story really for me, one of the first ways in which God surprised me about what God could do through kids was I was living in Mexico as a missionary. And at the end of a week-long mission trip, I would challenge the families that were there visiting with us to think about what it was that they were good at and how God might want to use that. And I remember I was giving this little talk about He can do anything with whatever it is that we offer him. And this boy was in the front row. He was 10 years old. And he raised his hand. He's like, I'm not really that good at anything. Can I please be excused? And I said, oh, I'm sure you're good at something. And I said, no, you need to stay here. Just ask God, what are you good at? And he's like, I'm really just good at Xbox. I said, okay, well, ask the Lord what he might be able to do with your Xbox. And he kind of sat in the front row for the rest of my time sharing with them. And then I had kind of forgotten about our exchange. Several weeks later, maybe 7 or 8 weeks later, I got a letter in our home mission office in Ohio. And it was a letter that included in it had a cashier's check for $410 and a note from this young man that said he went back to his Indiana elementary school and he hosted an Xbox tournament with a $10 entry fee. And he got some local businesses to donate prizes for the top performers. And he had 41 participants. So he sent this cashier's check for $410 to us. And he told me exactly how it is that he wanted to use it. And at the end of it, he goes, look what God was able to do with an Xbox. And I remember being so excited, not only for what the dollars that he had raised were going to be able to do for kids in the community he had seen had need, but really what was God going to do with a young man that decided he was take whatever it was that was in his hand and surrender it to God and watch God do something exciting with it. And that awakening, that started some thinking in my mind, because I think I just going to confess to you that I used to think of the givers and the goers in any kind of service opportunity, whether they were giving and going to something locally or giving and going to something globally, as means to an end. Like whatever it is or whatever population they were serving was the center of the bullseye, and we just needed to use the giver and goer to get there. But I remember like just having this big aha moment when I got that letter from that young man, Ben, and I thought, gosh, Jesus, you love that goer and that giver as absolutely as much as you love the kids who will be the recipient of his funds. Your ministry footprint isn't just so we would have eyes to see others for the sake of the others. Your heart is for all of us in the world to exchange and to engage with one another. And so I started to think about some of my own kids and certainly some of the kids that we were serving alongside. And I was thinking, if I make their world all about them, if I make sure that they have the right, practices and shoes and experiences and opportunities, and if I make their world all about them, at the end of 18 years of that, do I have any hope that, they're going to be other-centered and mission-minded? Probably not. When I was first a missionary, I don't do this anymore, but when I was first a missionary and the mission teams would come visit us, I used to make all of their lunches, which was pretty much peanut butter and jellies. And I have this really strong memory of one time standing around a kitchen island, and there were about 30 high school kids on a mission trip, and they were shouting out to me their like individual peanut butter and jelly orders, like, hey, I don't do crunchy peanut butter, and I don't like wheat bread, and I don't like chunks in my fruit, and I don't even like jelly. And I can remember making those sandwiches, thinking to myself the way you do before you have children, like one day when I have kids, they're going to eat peanut butter and jelly any way that somebody's going to make it for them. And so with that silly little goal in mind, the next year when we started our family, and ever since then, for the last 20 years, whenever I go to the grocery store, one week I buy wheat bread, and one week I buy white bread, and one week I buy crunchy peanut butter, and one week I buy creamy peanut butter, and one week I have, jelly, and some weeks jam, and some weeks nothing at all. And the goal was something as silly as I wanted them one day to be able to eat any kind of combination of peanut butter and jelly that it was ever offered to them anywhere. So I reverse engineered my choices with that ultimate goal in mind. And the same thing is true if we want young men and women that believe they have something to offer the world, and they have something in common with a world and people whose lives don't look anything like theirs. If that's what we want at the end of their childhood, then we need to reverse engineer some of our choices and make sure today we're doing things week in and week out that reinforce those kind of perspectives. When I think about adult engagement in missions or in service, the two biggest barriers that keep adults from engaging in the world is they think to themselves, I don't really have anything to offer. I mean, I don't speak a language, or I'm not handy, or I'm not good with kids, or I don't know how to answer their questions, or I'm whatever reason they count themselves out. They think they don't have anything to offer, or they think they don't have anything in common. Like, what do I know about whatever that population is that God's starting to call them towards? And it's much easier to sit down and to pull away than it is to engage in what God might have for them. So if we can start interacting with kids at an early age and say, we are so excited about what you have to offer. You have time, you have attention, you have, certain gifts and talents, you have a smile, you have a listening ear. Like what is it that you have in your hand? That's how my story started. I saw in an orphanage some preschool kids that were hiding the food we had brought for them under the mattress. And I thought to myself, what can I do about what it is that I'm seeing? What do I have in my hand? What do I have time? Do I have relationship? Do I have extra resources? And how can I offer those to these people, to these kids that were breaking my heart? If we can give that kind of impression. And it's Andy Stanley that says, do for one what you wish you could do for them all. And there's a verse in Zechariah 4:10 that I really want you to take to heart. It says, do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. Like, some of kids' first steps into service or missions, whether it's across the street or across the border, they're gonna be small, and they may not seem strategic, and they might feel like you can think of a better, faster, smarter way to do it or to multiply their effort. But God's looking really for two things. He's looking for their availability. He's looking for their willingness. And then he takes that kind of raw material and he does the multiplication. It's our job to encourage and to fan that flame, and to teach them about the difference between what we call load and burden. So Galatians chapter 2 verses 2 and 5 says this. Paul says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ. And then 3 verses later, he says, for each one of you should carry his own load. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, which one is it, Paul? Are we supposed to carry each other's burdens? Should we teach children to carry each other's burdens? Or should we teach them that each one of them should carry their own load? And if you look in the Greek behind those meanings, the word burden means something that somebody can't push uphill on their own. It's just literally too much for them. And the word load is about the weight of a soldier's backpack, about 35 pounds. And the principle in that passage is we want all people to be able to carry their own load. We're not going to try to strip them of any dignity. We want everyone to co-participate in the life that God's given them. But there might be moments when there's a burden. There's something that they can't push uphill on their own. And that's where the intervention of the church is so critical. That's where we get to teach kids to have eyes to see where God might be asking them to step into one of those stories. And when they step into that story, we have the chance to teach children about how to exchange. I think that one of the things that adults do wrong in service is they have kind of an us and them mentality. Like, I'm going to give something to them, but they don't need to give anything to me, because I don't want anything that they have to give you. And it kind of sounds good at first, but the truth is it's self-protective, and real healing happens in relationship. That's how people get hurt, is in relationship. So that's how people are healed in relationship. And when we're introducing children to compassionate ideas and to God's compassionate heart for the world, we've got to be careful not to do it through causes and charity, but instead through relationship, to teach them about, instead of, like in my area of expertise in orphan care, instead of teaching them big numbers about how many kids are orphaned or how many kids are in foster care, big sweeping things that might kind of overwhelm them, because how do you put your head around those numbers? Instead, tell them the story about a child who represents the population that you're trying to introduce them to. We've seen kids do some pretty spectacular things. I've watched kids, here are a couple ideas of ways in which I've seen kids engage in opportunities around the world. Like this one, they were really like a kindergarten, first grade class. They got seeds from their Sunday school teacher, and they planted these seeds in some dirt and cultivated some from young vegetables and young plants. And after taking care of them for a while, when the plants and the vegetables were healthy enough to sell, they sold them to the church population out in the parking lot. And then they gave that little seed money to start a program that they had been told about their church was getting involved in. And what I like about that process is they literally got their hands dirty. They were given a seed, and they actually co-participated with God to create something that they then got to monetize and earn that money in order to share it with something that was that they were taught was important in God's heart. And I like that they were investing in something the church had already decided was a priority for them, so that in that same way, maybe parents and children could have a shared vision for whether your church is interested in clean water, or you're interested in planting churches in unreached nations, or you're interested in orphan care, or whatever it is that breaks the heart of your particular congregation. You can involve your children in a way that's meaningful to them. One church that we had a relationship with, they had a real heart for literacy. And this young fourth grade girl decided to host a book swap where she asked all the kids in the children's ministry to bring 2 books on a particular Sunday. And everybody brought their 2 books, and they mixed them all up. And for every 2 books you brought, you were allowed to take 1 book home for free. So that was nice. Everybody got to go home with a new book for them to read on their own, and it didn't cost them anything. But with the remaining books, about 50% of the books that were brought, they sold those for $1 or $2, and they put all those proceeds to go towards a literacy project that somebody was working on in North Africa. And I like the idea that young girl thought about, I love reading and I love books, and I want to help some kids that are in another place in the world have a chance to love the same things I love. But she did it in a way that was meaningful to the other kids in her children's ministry. I thought that was a really creative way, that literacy swap. We watched, there was a church that had a heart for clean water. We were doing some well building in Africa, and some very creative second graders decided to, instead of having a lemonade stand the way that they had originally thought they might do, they made a little dirty water stand. So they had clean water that they flavored with a little bit of iced tea powder. So the water looked a little bit dirty, but it was clean for people to drink. They sold that slightly sweetened water at lemonade stands around their community. And when people came up to buy their dirty water, they gave a little piece of paper out telling them about the clean water project that they were investing in, and gave a couple statistics that they had learned about clean water. And I thought that, again, was a really meaningful, creative way for them to be able to do several things at one time, for them to be able to raise funds for the boreholes that they were raising money for. It was a way for them to educate the community. It was a way for them to physically get their own hands involved in a solution. And it's just a super creative idea. I've watched kids host movie nights. So these are, there was a church where every kid was supposed to host a movie night in their own community, and they could pick from one of these pre-approved movies that the children's pastor had selected. Then and I think they had like maybe $1 admission to their movie night at their house, and they served popcorn and some things like that. And then halfway through the movie, they had an intermission. And when they paused the movie for the intermission, these kids got up and shared with the kids in their community the orphan care project that they were wanting to invest in. And they said, we just want you to know there are kids around the world, and the money that you've spent tonight to get in and the money you've spent tonight for the popcorn is going to go towards this project. And again, I think the Lord does more than one thing at a time. He certainly raised some money that will go towards a project with kids that really need it, but he also gave a chance for kids to share passionately with their peers about something that was important to them. They were inspirational and educational, and on top of all that, they raised some money. And I think, again, those were some adults who could have thought of maybe ways that could have been smarter, bigger, faster, better, but instead they just came alongside and breathed life into the ideas the kids came up with and watched those kids believe that they have something to offer. One thing that we use a lot in orphanages around the world are weighted blankets. There's a lot of great research out about weighted blankets and what they do to promote sleep and reduce anxiety. And feel free to look it up later if you're interested. But weighted blankets are very expensive. And so there was one junior high ministry that decided, they got on Pinterest and got all crafty, and they learned how to turn regular blankets into weighted blankets. So they did a blanket drive in their church, and they got people involved in it. They told them a little bit about what weighted blankets do and some of the challenges that kids face who are growing up in children's homes. And then they had like a 24-hour lock-in, and they spent that time in that little craft project working in with those weighted blankets. And again, they did more than one thing at a time. They got their church involved. They had fellowship. They made an effective outreach tool. They invited their friends to get involved. Maybe some of them who didn't know who the Lord was, and got to see people who say they are Jesus followers actually doing things to bring, peace into the craziness of the world that's around them. And I mean, I could go on and on. I've seen lots of kids come up with really creative ideas, but I think part of what we have to do is make room for kids to have the freedom to think and not be shut down, and to brainstorm off each other, and to listen and listen to the Lord. And then as adults, it's our job to encourage and advocate, and probably do a little bit of driving and cheer them on and document what they're doing. And to remember that the Lord doesn't despise small beginnings. He just rejoices to see the work begin. And that work that we're talking about is the work inside of even their own hearts, as they believe that they have something in them that the Lord wants to offer. And I just think it's important that we remember the messages that we want kids to hear. My husband and I adopted a 12-year-old boy about 4.5 years ago, maybe 5 years ago now. And during the process of his adoption, it was about an 18-month process between when we met him and when he came home. And the government, where he was in the country where he was living, agreed for us to have Skype dates with him, opportunities for us to begin to build attachment while he was still living in that government institution, as we argued with him how important it was for us to get to know each other as fast as possible because of his advanced age. And about halfway through that 18 months, he got on the screen one night, and he was really sad because he had moved from an 8 to an 11-year-old dorm into a 12 to 18-year-old dorm. And that second dorm was really pretty intimidating. And so at the end of our time together, he didn't want to hang up, and I didn't want to hang up, and I definitely didn't want to hang up with how he was feeling. And so I was saying to him, hey, buddy, do you have some big feelings? This is what I do when I have big feelings. I remind myself of the things I know for sure to be true. And here's some things I know for sure to be true. Like, you're our son, and we're coming for you no matter how long it takes. And God has a plan. And I might not like it, and I might not understand it, but I promise you we can trust it. And I made him repeat that to me. He said those things. I said, just say that back to me. And so he's like, I'm your son, and you're coming for me, and God has a plan, and I can trust it. And then for the next 9 months, until we were able to travel to complete his adoption, that's how we hung up all of those 3-time-a-week Skype dates. We reminded ourselves of the things we knew for sure to be true. Fast forward 9 months later, it was time for us to go into the courtroom and complete the final step of that adoption. And as we walked into that courtroom, he was so excited. He knew he was coming to the United States later that week, and this was the last step, and he could change his name, and he was so excited. But when we walked into that courtroom, he got triggered because the last time he had been into a room like that, a family had fallen apart, not come together. And we continued to work around him, like psychologists and attorneys and social workers testified in court to the adoption proceedings. And Todd, my husband, and I share. But then finally it got to this point where his name is Tyler. Tyler was going to have to talk to the judge, because the way the law was written in his country, if he wanted to leave that country and come into ours, he was going to need to say with his own mouth that this is what he wanted, testify in open court. But he wasn't talking because he was struggling so much with that environment and his big feelings. And so I was rubbing his back, and I was talking to the judge, and I'm like, hey, do we have any workarounds here? Like, I don't know. I mean, can we clear everybody out of this courtroom? Can you go into your chambers? Can you write it down? I don't know if he's going to talk in this courtroom right now. And the judge is like, I'm sorry, this is the way the law's written. You have to do it in this place, in this way, for this to be completed. And so I started to rub his back, and then all of a sudden his little head popped up. And after a long, long amount of time, he looked at that judge and he said, I'm their son, and they came for me, and God has a plan, and I'm going to trust it. And I told him later that night, that's why we sow truth into our hearts, so that it's ready right there at a moment's notice when we most need it. And later that fall, he would go into an American junior high, and he didn't speak any English, and he was scared out of his mind and having big feelings. And I said to him, hey, listen to me. God has a plan. You don't have to like it. You don't have to understand it, but I promise you can trust it. And he walked into that junior high with that spiritual confidence. And when I think about kids engaging in mission and service, I think about all the ways the enemy is going to want to speak to them things that are lies, like what they're doing isn't making a difference, or that they don't have anything to offer, or they should feel embarrassed or shamed, or all the ways the enemy works anyway. He wants to work in kids' lives, especially as they begin to exercise muscles in the kingdom of God. And I think it's really important at the same time that we're teaching kids that God wants to use them, we need to teach them how much God loves them and sow into their hearts those truths so that at a moment's notice when they most need it, it's right there at the ready. I'll just finish with this passage in Exodus 33:11. There's this passage where Moses goes into the tent of the meeting, and it says, Joshua, the young son of Nun, follows him up there in that tent of the meeting. And Moses gets the download like he's supposed to, and then he goes back down to tell everybody in God's family what it is the Lord had told him. And it says that the Lord and Moses talk face to face as one would a friend. That's Exodus 33:11. But the last part of that verse says that after Moses leaves and goes down the mountain to do God's work, that Joshua, the young son of Nun, stays behind in the tent of the meeting. And I think that young man followed his mentor into that space and so captivated by what it looked like to be in God's presence. Even though Moses left to go away, Joshua didn't want to do that. And I think that's our role. We've got to take kids into that tent of the meeting and tell them this is what it looks like to be face to face with the Lord like one would a friend. This is what it looks like to get a download from him, to hear him give us direction and encouragement. And may they be so captivated with that experience, they don't want to leave the tent.